and then Christine will be speaking first, and then Gregory, and then we'll have some time for conversation. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, well, Betsy, thank you so much for inviting Greg and me to the space, and thank you all for hosting us. And I know that we gave you quite a bit of reading. We didn't expect you necessarily to go through all of it, but it's there for your reference, and we have tons and tons of more stuff, including on the K-Policy website. And Greg also has incredible writings on Korea, so you should definitely check. There's stuff out there, and in the spirit of IF Stone, it's open source, so you could find it pretty easily. But I'll go ahead and begin, and let me just call up my very primitive PowerPoint presentation. I wanted to begin my presentation by, oh, sorry, it's one of those really sensitive, I have a sensitive mouse. I wanted to begin the presentation by just mentioning what should have been amply obvious from the readings from today, which is that the Korean War is, in point of fact, not over. And how do we understand the reverberations and manifestations of a counter-revolutionary war that was the first hot war of the Cold War, and its irresolution in the supposedly post-Cold War present? And so I think that this is a question that's particularly apt for us as people who are based in the United States. How do we understand the ongoing nature of the Korean War as a permanent war? And what are our obligations with regard to a war of imperialist intervention that this country waged in Korea that persists to this day in both obvious ways and non-obvious ways? So I wanted to begin by, let me see, sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. There's an activist scholar in South Korea. His name is Kang Jong-gu, who is with the organization Solidarity for Peace and Reunification in Korea, or SPARC. And I had the opportunity to interview him, my goodness, over a decade ago. And during this time, he said something so striking to me. He was speaking about why it was that Korea persisted in being divided. And so the United States was the author of Korea's division. So shortly after the US atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States basically deputized 2 junior military officers who were armed apparently with a National Geographic map, and they had consulted with no Korean, to basically retire to a room and divide Korea into occupation zones, one Soviet, the other one US. And these junior officers made sure that Seoul was in the US zone of occupation. And this was not meant to be an international border. It was intended to be an occupation line. Yet when North Korea crossed this occupation line, it was read as international aggression. And when the United States crossed the line, it was viewed as liberation. It was framed as such. And so the sort of interesting question is, how and why does the Korean Peninsula remain divided to this day? And in the long wake of 9/11, when I was in South Korea, I spoke with Kang Jong-gu, and he had this to say. He said, to reverse its loss of power. So the United States interested in maintaining its dominance and its, attempt at hegemony on the global stage. The United States has targeted global weak points. In many cases, the destabilization or the weakness of these points has everything to do with US intervention in the first place. And here he named the divided Korean Peninsula and the Middle East. And he stated here there had been this incident, the Cheonan incident, that was relatively recent at that time. He said, we could see how this justified successive war exercises between the United States, South Korea, Japan, India, and Australia. And he said, from the perspective of US foreign policy, the divided Korean Peninsula offers a flexible occasion for a staging of power transitions within the arena of global politics. Korea can serve as a facilitator, a weakener, an accelerator, a delayer, and so on. So I think that this is such a useful account of the way in which Korea, which might otherwise seem like an over there parochial concern, actually has geostrategic significance beyond its actual geographic location. I mean, it's everything because of that location, but it has a kind of far-reaching regional and global geostrategic value. And I want to say this too. This is, my God, I mean, it's just so hard to believe. We are in 2023. This marks the 70th year of the signing of the Armistice Agreement. And that Korean War Armistice Agreement did not bring the Korean War to a close. It halted the hot fighting phase, battle phase of the Korean War, but it left unchallenged a permanent war structure on the peninsula. And if you look at the Armistice Agreement, which was signed by China, North Korea, and the United States, South Korea declined to sign, you can see that there is the strong recommendation that within 3 months' time, the three signatories return to the peace table, to the bargaining table to hammer out a permanent peace agreement. Also within the Armistice Agreement is the recommendation that foreign forces remove their militaries from the peninsula. China did this within a short period of time. The United States, as you can see, remains a military occupying force in the southern part of the peninsula. It has roughly 80 military installations in the south, and it has roughly 30,000 military forces concentrated in the south to this day. And also in contravention of the Armistice Agreement, the United States has historically contravened it by placing military weapons on the Korean Peninsula. And so this is just to say that we have a peace structure that feels anything but peaceful. And this is all also within a historical moment, in which we see the remilitarization of Japan, right? And we also see the United States going to its historic ally, not just Japan, but also the Philippines. And with, Bongbong Marcos, requesting that the Philippines reopen its doors to US military occupation. And this is what figures like the anti-base critic Roland Simbulan described, like the United States bases as the basis of the insecurity of the Filipino people. And I think it's important to recall that this kind of militarized clientelism that we see getting reanimated with regard to Japan, with regard to the Philippines, with regard to sites like South Korea, that this basically was a dynamic that in the 1970s, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman referred to this as a dynamic of sub-fascism, right? And so this kind of piece of US militarism, let me go to this, is what the Korean War historian Bruce Cummings, in speaking about the genocidal massacre that occurred in 1948 on Jeju, he refers to this as the piece of a political graveyard. And so you can see how what the United States waged and this isn't, I should say Jeju is an island that designates the southernmost part of the Korean Peninsula. And in 1948, which was the year that the Genocide Convention came into being, the United States basically unleashed counter-revolutionary forces in Jeju, leading to just widespread genocide. And this counter-revolutionary war that was unleashed, from 1948 onward, and this also reflects the fact that Japanese colonialism, there was never decolonization in the southern part of the Korean Peninsula in the wake of Japanese imperialism on Korea. Instead, US militarism supplanted Japanese imperialism, and that's including in sites like Jeju. And I just want to say here that it's this kind of piece of the political graveyard that goes by the name of peace. And we might recall here Frantz Fanon's phrase, peaceful violence. So what you see here is sort of counterinsurgent peaceful violence. And I'm also reminded Chris Marker, the French filmmaker and photographer, went to North Korea and just saw unspeakable devastation. And he asked a phrase that accompanied a book of photographs that photographs that he took while in North Korea. He asked the question, who can remember who burned with the houses? So, everything was reduced to ashes. And he said, who could remember who burned with the houses? I mean, this is, this sort of death toll, of the Korean War was so exceedingly vast. Bruce Cummings states that it was 4 million people. There are some accounts that even place it higher. Someone like Curtis LeMay, who was known as Bombs Away LeMay, he was very proud of, through US aerial warfare, reducing the population of the Korean Peninsula by what he boasted was 20%. And that percent was far higher in the north, which was construed as a giant red region. And I also want to say that in Jeju, there's a local phrase, and it's something to the effect of 1,000 ancestors, one descendant. And I just want to go to this. Kim Sopom was a writer, a Zainichi writer in Japan. So whereas many, during the Japanese colonial period, there were many Koreans from the northern part of the peninsula who went into Manchuria or Manchukuo. In the southern part, and this is very true of Jeju, many Jeju Islanders were taken as slave labor to Japan, and some of their descendants were in the post-war, post-World War II period. They had the status of Zainichi or foreign resident within Japan. And this author was originally, his family was from Jeju, and he became a Zainichi in the post-World War II era. And this is how he describes what happened on this island of Jeju. He says, the faint smell of smoke and ash remained, but the memory of the place was already gone. This village, which was close to the coastal area of Jeju, which is an island, had already been soaked in gasoline, prepared for incineration. The whole surface of the island was turning black, not gradually, but instantly turning into wasteland. The government had left the coastal villages near the new road intact, but they had burned a several-kilometer radius around the base of Mount Hala, turning it into a vast ocean of wasteland. Everything was basically burned, including graveyards. And one of the foremost public historians of the 4/3 Jeju massacre, his name is Kim Jong-min. He describes what occurred here on Jeju as of a genealogy of scorched earth policy that has to be traced to US Indian wars. And so he draws a direct line from that. And so you could see that this is what happened in the South. This is what happened in the South. And Jeju was deemed to be an area of sort of red agitation, but the way that it was turned red was through the blood of the people who were killed. If you think about this, North Korea was a giant red region. And in the north, in Pyongyang, which is the capital of North Korea, in the middle part of the 20th century, it had about 400,000 residents. The United States unleashed 420,000 bombs on North Korea, more than one per resident. And so I always just say this, and I'm sort of a broken record about this, but this is the very definition of overkill. And nothing was spared. Civilian infrastructure, dams, schools, everything was targeted. And the devastation was immense. I think Betsy can attest to this too. When you go to North Korea, it is impossible not to meet people whose families were directly impacted by the all-encompassing violence of the Korean War. And the Korean War persists in many ways. And I think that Greg will be speaking to this possibly, and I don't want to encroach too much into this. But during this time, like even in 1951, there was a delegation of socialist women, an international delegation that went to North Korea. And they said that there was nothing left to bomb. Nothing. Nothing was left standing. It was so thoroughgoing. The NYU historian Marilyn Young once observed that even though there was this extraordinary incendiary violence that wiped out entire villages, and despite the fact that there was this kind of violence, she stated that the Korean War did not rise above what she called background noise in the United States. And in fact, in 1951, when that socialist delegation was observing that there was nothing left to bomb, nothing left standing, the US News and World Report already dubbed this war a forgotten war. And it was described as forgotten at home with no end in sight. That is a powerful prediction of how the Korean War structurally persists as forgotten in our current moment. But when you look at, as I.F. Stone did, and Greg and Tim Beale, a New Zealand scholar also of North Korea, when you look at their really wonderful introduction, you could see that I.F. Stone did amazing open source research. I mean, this is a time when US foreign policy is becoming covert. There are national security doctrines that make, this is a time that basically incubates what the CIA will later call blowback. But even at this time, if you examine open source materials, you can see, let me just say this, and then I'll go back to this point, which is that basically, in contrast to the sort of legacy of forgetting that is the structural legacy of part and parcel of being within the United States, North Korea retains what Bruce Cummings refers to as, it's the designation of being the party of memory. And you could see here that, I don't know if you can quite make it out, but this is mosaic. So there's little tiles here, so this is not painted, it's rendered in more permanent material. And when you go to North Korea and you see these mosaic images, and if you ask, like, why is it made out, like, why this material? And it's to render this a permanent message. And this roughly translates into revenge against the American jackals, right? Like 1,000-year revenge against American jackals. And oftentimes this is sort of, scoffed at as sort of knee-jerk anti-American violence without understanding the thoroughgoing nature of the devastation and the fact that the majority of people who were killed, and we're talking about a death count in the millions again, were civilians, right? And just to go back to the US side of things, Giovanni Arrighi writes that in the wake of World War II, the United States basically was placed on permanent war footing. It was a total war economy. There's so many ways in which World War II is romanticized in the American historical imagination. It's understood to be a war against fascism. It's very much complicated by the nature of US imperialism supplanting Japanese imperialism in the former Pacific theater. There are also like sort of figures like Rosie the Riveter. So World War II is imagined as a kind of opportunity that in terms of the domestic arena becomes an arsenal of democracy in FDR's terms, and previously reviled minorities, women, migrants, people of color that had been discriminated against in various labor sectors, all of a sudden have an opportunity to start working in factories, et cetera, and factories that were making nails are now the production shifts to making bullets. If you were making tractors, you are now making tanks, et cetera. And this is viewed as a kind of civil rights opportunity. Like, war expands civil rights opportunity, and it's understood as having a kind of liberal legacy. But the fact of the matter is that the United States during World War II became a total war economy. And Giovanni Arrighi rightly points out that massive rearmament during the Second World War required a solution. It required an economic solution. It required permanent warfare. And so this is what he writes. What was required was an international emergency. And since November 1949, Secretary Aitchison had been predicting that one would occur somewhere in 1950 in the Asian rimlands in Korea, Vietnam, Taiwan, possibly all three. 2 months after the president examined NSC 68, that crisis happened. As Aitchison would later say, Korea came along and saved us. This is something that I.F. Stone also notes in his work. And what was the phrase that General Van Fleet stated, Greg? It was something like there had to be a Korea here or elsewhere around the globe, something like that. Was it?
That's it exactly.
Oh, that's it exactly. Okay.
Whether
So,
it was there or somewhere else, there had to be a
yeah,
Korea.
there or somewhere else, but thank God for that. And so what does, thinking about Korea, not in any sort of parochial sense, but what is the structural legacy that is ongoing to this day? The Korean War paves the way for the largest restructuring of the federal government up until the point of Homeland Security. It authorizes the national security state. And it's not just with Homeland Security, the Department of Homeland Security, that the United States is waging multi-directional warfare, not just warfare over there, but warfare domestically. The national security state authorizes that too, right? And the Korean War also paves the way for what Chalmers Johnson calls the U.S. empire of bases. It authorized radical militarized expansion across the globe. And this is understood by people across the world and in Asia, where hot wars break out, as US fascism. It's called that by Black radicals, but it's also called that by peoples around the world. It also gives rise to the military-industrial complex. It places the United States on permanent war footing. And that is the legacy of the Korean War, which has never been resolved with a peaceful settlement of any kind. And so the United States basically, this Korean War is useful. It authorizes a US permanent war economy, the military-industrial complex, the national security state, a US empire of bases globally, and it's cushioned in a domestic regime of forgetting, right? And so I just wanted to say a little bit about this, which is that the Taiwanese scholar, his name is Kwan-Sing Chen. Kwan-Sing Chen, he states that decolonization as a project failed because de-imperialization didn't happen. And he states that the first step of de-imperialization is demobilization. The United States is mobilized for war, but people within the United States do not necessarily feel the United States to be militarized. And so there is a kind of structural disconnect between, I'll just leave it at that, but I want to say something specific about North Korea. So in the supposed wake of the Cold War, which never concludes, and certainly not on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea reemerged in the crosshairs of the US war machine. And I don't know if you were able to read an article that I wrote for the Critical Asian Studies special issue on North Korean human rights. But in the wake of 9/11, it wasn't just random that North Korea is slotted alongside both Iraq and Iran as part of the axis of evil. All three sites had been targets of US prior interventions and were being placed again, within the crosshairs of the US war machine. And what happened during this time was there was a really interesting moralizing human rights discourse that sort of greased, the way for the war machine to proceed. And it was very much a kind of imperialist, interventionist human rights discourse. There was nothing of a kind of anti-colonial human rights vocabulary, which had previously existed, where human rights was a kind of zone that wasn't monopolized by an imperialist agenda, throughout the Cold War. But you saw in the wake of 9/11, it really getting monopolized for the purpose of imperial intervention. And this German scholar, Eva Horn, has this expression, epistemology of enmity. And she states that the task of intelligence is to penetrate into forbidden and protected space, cross or transgress borders, investigate the enemy's territory. And North Korea has long been referred to by the CIA as a black hole, totally impenetrable. And what happened was, it was so interesting to see how North Korean defectors became the appointed spokespeople who were funded by the National Endowment for Democracy to speak on behalf of North Korea. So North Korea was not recognized as a legitimate country, but the North Korean defector was deputized in US congressional arenas, at international human rights conferences, and on the global stage. They were subsidized as the more legitimate voice of North Korea. And also the other way in which human rights technologically manifested was through these satellite images. And all of a sudden, even these sort of armchair human rights activists could, through Google Earth, penetrate into North Korea and find prison camps, etc. Supposed prison, like, this is a prison camp, and the way that it was annotated would bring this sort of space into being. And in that moment, I thought it was really important to note that the principal ways in which human rights campaigns knew or were knowing North Korea were through defectors and through satellite images. This is known in intelligence circles as human and image. And they were the two principal ways that Colin Powell presented irrefutable knowledge at the United Nations to make the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, thus leading the United States into an unending, quote unquote, war on terror. And I think that here, so you could just see, here we understand that intelligence isn't just information, and it certainly doesn't correspond to facts per se. And so, Colin Powell didn't have flawed intelligence. He actually had extremely successful intelligence, because intelligence is not about facts, much less the truth. It's really about mastery over the terrain of information and what is accepted as fact, and here paving the way for renewed US interventionism. And so I just wanted to, I think that I'll end here and yield the floor to Greg.
Thank you, Christine. Greg, feel free to take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, Betsy, for inviting Christine and me to speak. Appreciate it. And thank you to the committee for hosting us. Appreciate that also. If anyone would like to read further along the lines of Christine's quite eloquent presentation, I highly recommend her book, A Violent Peace. It's a very powerful reading. you can't do better than that, I think. So I have a slide deck to share too. Let's see if we can do this. Can everyone see my screen, my slide deck?
Yes.
Okay, great. So my talk is going to be on South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol and his project to reshape South Korea. So he was elected last year on March 9th, defeating Democratic Party candidate Lee Jae-myung. It was a very narrow win for Yoon. He won by less than 1%. And despite that narrow win, and despite the fact that the opposition Democratic Party holds the majority in the National Assembly, Yoon nevertheless interprets his win as a mandate to completely reshape South Korea, not only now, but in the years and even decades ahead. So a cornerstone of his plans for South Korea is his labor reform. So philosophically, Yoon thinks of himself as a follower of Milton Friedman, the patron saint of neoliberal economics. And he describes Friedman's book, Free to Choose, as a book that had the greatest influence on the formation of what he calls values of a sort, I suppose. And it's also reported that Yoon is currently studying the labor policies of Margaret Thatcher, who smashed the miners' union in Great Britain, and Ronald Reagan, who smashed the air traffic controllers union. He's studying their policies and apparently has something of the sort in mind for South Korea. In fact, I'll get to it a little bit later, but he's already started with a union bashing. So Yoon ties together the economic growth with his policy of labor reform. And he says we must drive economic growth through labor reform. So what does he mean by labor reform? In a meeting with business leaders in January, he described labor unions as an evil that are blocking growth. So labor unions are basically to be swept aside or crushed or basically emasculated and made powerless. That's his labor reform in a nutshell. So he blames labor unions for being privileged and demanding, well paid, and he prefers a performance system rather than seniority. As he calls unions, they're vested interests. So he wants to, he says you can't have in a civilized country where you have some workers doing the same work for a lot more pay than others. So he's contrasting union workers versus non-union, and he's not arguing for bringing up the living standards of non-union workers. He's arguing for bringing down the labor wages of union workers. So currently, another aspect of his labor reform is that currently South Korea has during 1 month period, workers are limited to a maximum of 52 hours per week on average. He wants to eliminate that and change it to a maximum of average of 120 hours per week. As he puts it, giving workers the right to decide for themselves on working conditions can be good for the company as well as the workers. Of course, it's not the workers who decide on working up to 120 hours a week, it's their businesses. He also considers labor strikes, as being sort of a violation of the rule of law, as he puts it. So he argues that we have to provide a way to prevent unnecessary labor disputes and conflicts. His whole philosophy is basically business friendly. He's also plans to eliminate business regulations and cut corporate taxes and capital gains taxes as well. So his first target was the cargo truckers strike. So about 90% of truckers are what is called independent operators. How independent they are is another question, but it's a way of reducing the amount of benefits they can count on as drivers. There was a temporary safe trucking freight rates system that was due to expire last December. That system ensured that truckers were guaranteed a minimum living wage, no matter how much fuel prices would rise. So that would cover them and adjust so that they could still maintain a living standard of wage. That system also prioritized safety by limiting the amount of long hours of speeding that truckers were forced to do, had been forced beforehand in order to meet tight schedules. So the union was not willing to discuss extending this system beyond December. And that's what the cargo truckers went on strike for. They were arguing, like, let's talk about extending the system. It's good for not only people who have to make a living this way, but for the safety of everybody on the road. If you aren't driving workers to incredibly long hours. So union basically gaslighted the strikers by saying that their labor union was not a labor union. Therefore, their strike was illegal. Then he threatened strike. He issued a return to work order and saying that anybody who refused to return to work would be threatened with the loss of their driver's license, the trucking license, and fines of up to $23, and even prison sentences of up to 3 years. Under the circumstances, the union members narrowly voted to go back to work, and union unfortunately succeeded in crushing the strike. And that system that protected their living standards is also gone. Unfortunately, union had support from the mainstream media, which condemned the strikers as harming the economy and a threat to everybody in the country as a whole. And due to that heavy media manipulation, Yoon got a 9-point lift in his approval rating, which is only encouraging him to take on other unions, which we'll see in a moment. So what is taking on the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, the KCTU? It's one of the 2 largest trade union confederations in South Korea, and it's by far the more militant confederation. So his tool for tackling the KCTU is to accuse them, or at least some members to start with, of violating the National Security Act, which is so vaguely written, and it dates back decades to the period of following the Korean War. Basically, a person who praises or commits what can be termed anti-government or activities, or a member of such an organization, or person who has contact with such an organization. And so, what is an anti-government organization? Well, it's vaguely worded. It can mean anything you want it to mean, and often has been used to arrest anyone who's deemed too progressive. So a few years ago, for example, I met a labor activist from South Korea who had just been released from serving a 2-year sentence, a prison sentence, during the rule of Park Geun-hye. And what was his crime? The police raided his home and found some magazines that had political magazines that had articles by international authors with a social democratic orientation. It was not very radical, really, but I mean, these were just normal articles like you could find, say, maybe in Monthly Review here in the United States. So he served 2 years in prison for that. So it can be used for anyone for any reason. is currently being used against the KCTU. So Yoon has sent the National Intelligence Service, which is the like the Korean equivalent of combining the CIA and the FBI and police, to raid a number of organizations recently. The most prominent raid was on the main office and other offices of the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, and also raiding homes of some members of the KCTU. So in all, I think there were, let's see, something like 15. After they raided the KCTU, the next day, they raided 14 offices and homes of a construction union. And the hallmark of all these raids is that the police and the NIS are searching and seizing computer drives, electronic data, documents, and mobile phones. It's like they're going on a fishing expedition to see what information they can gather that they can misinterpret, or misrepresent, I should say, to trigger additional investigations and charges. They've also raided the offices of the Justice Party, which is a small progressive party, and also a small progressive media group, and other groups as well. I think there's also a Jeju peace group that was raided. And this week, police arrested 4 individuals, and they indicted a 5th person as well. So the people, the KCTU members who were arrested and progressives who were arrested, are accused of having waved Korean unification flags at an international shooting championship in Changwon, in which a North Korean athletes had participated. So they waved this unification flag, same unification flags that they have flown during other international sporting events in which both Koreas had participated. Nothing unusual in that. They were also accused of holding demonstrations opposing US military exercises in South Korea. Investigators charged that these activities were not done by choice, but that these KTCU members participated in those activities under the orders of North Korea, which is utterly ridiculous. Progressives have a very strong commitment to the concept of Korean unification, and they're strongly opposed to US military exercises. They don't need North Korea to order them to do this. The National Intelligence Service also claims that the individuals exchanged encrypted messages and met with North Korean officials in Cambodia and Vietnam. The NIS said that it is very likely, quote unquote, very likely that the suspects formed an underground organization and conducted missions. In other words, this is supposition. That they're supposing that such a thing. It reminds me of years ago when the Unified Progressive Party was outlawed under fabricated charges. It's very similar to now. And they were accused of having an underground organization, which actually did not exist. At this point, no evidence has been publicly made available, so it's kind of hard to talk about the details. But one has to wonder if the NIS is once again fabricating evidence. The Korean Health and Medical Workers Union, which was also raided and had their computers and cell phones seized, charged that the Yoon administration is conducting a witch hunt to make trade unions look like anti-state organizations and stoke public hatred towards trade unions and isolate them from society. And that's exactly what it is. If you paint trade unions as being traitors or a threat to national security, you're basically making the whole concept of labor unions radioactive in the public eye. It's a way of trying to crush labor unions as a whole. Now, the other aspect in which Yoon is trying to permanently change the direction of South Korea is his close relationship with the US military and wanting to basically subordinate South Korea's military to the interests of US imperialism. So this is like a dream come true for the Biden administration, whose his favorite pet phrase is "America is back," which means imperialism is back here, there, all over the globe. But Biden prioritizes relationships with allies. He considers U.S. allies as what he calls force multipliers. In other words, when the U.S. goes to war, other nations are expected to join the U.S. war as a force multiplier, further strengthening U.S. attacks. So the U.S. Indo-Pacific Strategy document, let's look at a couple of these quotes here on the screen. We'll focus on every corner of the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. wants total domination of the entire region. And again, we'll prioritize our single greatest asymmetric strength, a network of security, alliances, and partnerships, in which, of course, South Korea, as well as Japan and other nations, are expected to be junior partners. So what is South Korea's role exactly in the alliance? Other than what I just said. So Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, the United States is now making a big push to revitalize our friends. And here's force multipliers again. And the South Korean Foreign Minister Park Jin recently said that the alliance should go beyond solely focusing on bilateral relations and contribute to freedom and all these cliches here on a regional and global level. In other words, South Korean military is not there only to defend South Korean territory, but it should participate with the United States on a global level wherever the U.S. chooses to intervene. So NATO moves east. We'll going to be seeing more and hearing more of NATO having a hand in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, NATO has repeatedly said they're not looking to have Asia-Pacific nations join NATO. So NATO members will still be in Europe. However, they are looking at Asia-Pacific nations to work with NATO as partners in NATO operations. So that could be anything, any level of support. And of course, bringing a NATO focus on China is a way of framing the U.S. anti-China campaign as a global coalition. So rather than being U.S. hostility, they want to present it as a global coalition, the same way that they're trying to present policy with Russia as a global coalition. So NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said, yes, China is many ways far away, but it matters for our security. So the idea that we can confine our security only to the Euro-Atlantic area, that doesn't work anymore. In other words, NATO's going global. And again, some other quotes there, as you see, that NATO is looking to move east in regard to operations. And again, Stoltenberg, some other quotes. Yeah, you can count on NATO to stand with the Republic of Korea, and in the speech in Japan. So Korea can count on NATO, and Japan can count on NATO. In other words, NATO's there to meddle. Give me a moment to look at those other quotes again. Again, it's the global approach for NATO. So the first step that South Korea took with NATO actually came 4 days before Yoon took office. The National Intelligence Service signed up to join NATO's Cyber Defense Center. So what is the Cyber Defense Center? It's an organization of NATO and like-minded states that participate collectively in cyber defense operations. At least that's how it was initially conceived. However, at the 2018 NATO summit, NATO decided that it would employ what it called the full range of cyber capabilities, by which they meant not only defensive, but offensive activities. As one high-ranking military official put it at the time, speaking at NATO about offensive cyber was blasphemy a few years ago. We have advanced. So NATO said it won't seek offensive cyber capabilities on its own. Instead, it will rely on the capabilities of member states and partner states that volunteer to conduct offensive cyber operations on behalf of NATO. At the time of the 2018 summit, it was reported that 5 member states had volunteered to conduct offensive cyber operations on behalf of NATO. How many more have joined since then is not publicly known. Now, I don't believe that South Korea initially has volunteered to engage in offensive cyber operations. I don't think they would do that quite so soon. But Yoon is so clearly subordinating South Korean national security and military to U.S. interests that I believe is certainly a possibility that at some point South Korea will volunteer to engage in offensive cyber operations. Again, it's unknown whether that will actually happen or not, but it's certainly a possibility with Yoon and his philosophy. Japan also last November joined this group as well. So exercise pitch black, what is that? It actually got very little media coverage, which is kind of surprising given how enormously important I think it was. It took place in Australia between August 19th and September 8th last year. 16 nations participated in this military exercise, including South Korea, Japan, and NATO members, such as the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany. According to the Australian Air Commodore Tim Alsop, air-to-air refueling, which a number of these planes in this exercise tested out, air-to-air refueling is a force multiplier, providing essential reach to our combat aircraft. And working with many of the participating nations aims to increase our force projection and maximize capability. So some of these quotes here, German Air Force Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt, we're sending a clear message. The Air Force, the German Air Force that is, can be deployed quickly and over global distances. And the British Air Vice Marshal Phil Robertson said much the same, that these exercises test the ability to deploy air power at speed to any part of the world. So definitely NATO conceives of a future direction as being able to intervene militarily anywhere in the world, including the Asia Pacific. So what lies ahead? According to a joint statement of the South Korean Defense Minister Lee Jong-suk and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, they both pledged to expand the level and scale of this year's combined exercises and conduct a large-scale combined joint fires demonstration this year. They're definitely ramping up exercises, including, in fact, just this week, there was exercise where B-1 bombers flew off the coast of the Korean Peninsula. B-1 bombers have the largest payload of any bomber in the U.S. Air Force. And these two officials also agreed to work towards aligning their Indo-Pacific strategies. In other words, align according to the United States direction. So that's what. Now here's an interesting quote that also didn't get much attention, but I think it's highly significant. U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, Eli Ratner, was quoted as saying, "I think it is fair to say that, in my view, 2023 is likely to stand as the most transformative year in U.S. force posture in the region in a generation." So the U.S. military is planning some truly significant, or as Ratner put it, transformative changes in this year ahead. What exactly those changes are, I don't know, but it's obvious it's going to be in a more aggressive and dangerous direction. That's the only direction they know. And here's another Ratner quote in the same article that he was quoted in, is, "I think folks," and by folks he's referring to the Washington establishment, "I think folks are going to be quite satisfied with the results that are going to be rolling out throughout 2023. So there's going to be a number of changes that the U.S. military is going to be rolling out throughout this year. I think this is going to be moving in a very dangerous direction. And with right-wing governments in Japan and South Korea, the Biden administration sees this as exactly the right moment when they can try to do this kind of thing. Now, South Korea, geographically speaking, is on the front line of U.S. imperialism's confrontation with China and North Korea. That places South Korean activists on the front line of resistance. They face a difficult challenge when the entire diplomatic, economic, and military power of the United States is directed at dominating the Asia-Pacific region. However, South Korean activists have a long history of bold and spirited resistance. Weekly candlelight rallies have already been underway in South Korea, trying to build a movement to oppose Yoon's plans. One should not underestimate the power of Korean progressives. Against long odds, they brought down military rule, and more recently, they succeeded in toppling former President Park Geun-hye. If the U.S. expects quiet acquiescence, it may be in for a surprise.
Thank you, Greg. And thanks, Christine, for sharing your excellent presentations.